Now, our first lesson will be on evaluating primary sources, meaning we will try to check the different sources that we are going to use in the study of history. Okay, I asked you last time to give a definition of history, and most of you tend to define history as the study of the past. Okay, now
Yes.
you would always define it as a study of the past, a chronicle about past events. What uh, uh, that's actually how we tend to define history. Okay, now try to look into the definition of history there. In the past, we tend to define that as a narrative accounts of past events or knowledge of the past. Therefore, if we are going to look into your definitions, nga ginhatag last time, it's all about telling something about the past. It's all about knowing something about the past. That's why if we are going to look into it, uh, sometimes history is being associated with the concept of a story, a narrative, or a chronicle. Kaya magambal ka nga history, do story malang na, istorya. That's why historia, di ba? That's how we tend to describe it. It may refer also to any consideration of imaginary events or incidents held to be true. Ang mga events nga natabo sa past or mga imaginary events nga natabo or mga incidente nga natabo, but we tend to believe that those events are true. That's why we tend to say that it is part of history. Have discussed today would already become part of the past. It would become part of history. But that definition of history as accounts of past events or knowledge about the past is how people before tend to define history. That is no longer the way we need to define history. Now, how how did the change happen? How did the change in the definition of history happen? Now, it tend to evolve and develop in the following ways. First, if you were able to see there, the idea of history moved absolutely towards an account of past real events. The idea there is we are not just telling stories about the past, but the kind of stories that we are telling are actually real events. Natabo gid siya. It's not just something a hearsay or a story, something naging obra-obra lang, but it's actually a real event. Now, from that, it took into the distinctive character of an organized knowledge of the past. It's not just about the story of the past, but that story or that particular past was actually organized into a coherent knowledge. Meaning, it's not just an ordinary story, but that story was actually about past real events and that was organized into a systematic way. Okay? Now, and apart from that, it does not only includes the past, but it shed also an exclusive understanding of the recent developments, ang mga natabo-subong, and becomes directly connected not only to the present but also to the future. That's why the studying history is not only about the past, but it is also about the present and the possible effect that it may have into the future. Okay? Now, that's why some would tend to say nga natabo ni siya subong man because maybe there is something in the past nga waay naglearn ang tao. Okay? It is also interpreted as a variety of mass historical forces that are products of the past, not only active and influential in the present, but lived on as necessities intended to shape the future in logical and understandable ways. Meaning, We need not just to discuss it as something that is only about the past, but we need to look into how that past tend to influence the present and how it tend to shape our future in a logical and understandable ways. Human society's overall development. Meaning, we tend to look into the overall development of the human society, but this overall development was actually influenced by the past. Meaning, what or how we are right now, ano man kita subong, is because this is the product of the past. We are actually the product of our past. Now, apart from that, it focused also on interpreting and handling a wide variety of relevant and significant sources in understanding why and how change occurs, and is no longer concerned with capturing a detailed record or knowledge of the past. Now, what we are looking right now when we study history is we look into the relevance as well as the significance of different sources. Meaning, we tend to look into sources, we evaluate the source, we try to look into how relevant or significant the source in giving us an understanding kung nga kag paano natabo ang isa ka bagay before. Why is it that or why is it that Magellan came to the Philippines? What are the things that were responsible in the coming of Magellan to the Philippines? What's the result or the effect of the coming of Magellan into our country? Now we tend to look into that. It's no longer about the detailed record or knowledge of the past. Why natagalan tao kung ano gid ang detalyado nga pag-record ng past, but what we are looking into is what is the relevance or the significance of this particular event in the development of our society. Now, it is not only about people, but it includes how people shape their landscape, the technologies they used, and the ideas and beliefs that sustained, united, and divided them. Meaning, before, when we talk about the past kasi, we tend to look into the people sa may sinunang mga tao. Kung maghambal ka sa ancient history of the Philippines, we tend to look into Lapu-Lapu, Magellan, Humabon. But now, it's not the only concern. Hindi lang naamo ng concern. We tend to look into kung ano ang mga beliefs, ano ang mga ideas, ano ang technology nga may ara sila before that was able to make them important or relevant. Like for example, ano nga technology ang gingamit ni what? Ano nga technology ang gingamit sa mga grupo ni Lapu-Lapu in order for them to be able to defeat the men or the group of Magellan? That's the meaning of history. That's the present meaning of history, meaning it's no longer concerned only about the past events, but it is also concerned about the importance, the dynamics of the relationship, as well as the relevance and the significance of that particular event. We are looking into the definition of history in order for us to be able to fulfill our learning outcome, which is to evaluate primary sources. Why? Because when we study history, we need to look into sources, because it's no longer it's not just stories mo. What we are looking into are past real events, and those past real events could be supported by the primary sources, and these primary sources must be credible, authentic, and provenance. I don't know if you're familiar with the Maharlika something na nag-viral sa Facebook before or sa YouTube, and the Taliano family nga hambal nila, they are the ones owning the country. They have the land title of the Philippines. If you are going to ask if that is true or not, then my answer to that is they should first present their sources. They should present a primary source. Now, this time, in our understanding of the past, or in our understanding of the significance and importance of the past, then we need to evaluate the past by looking into primary and secondary sources. That's why when we study history, study of history must rely on evidence. We cannot say that that is authentic history, credible history, or genuine history or authentic history if there is no evidence that would prove it. And these evidences could be primary source or a secondary source. These sources are important for us to validate and substantiate an argument. Amo na kung ga-debate ka mo, mahambal ka, what is your evidence? What is your source? Is the source of your information credible, authentic, or reliable? If the source is credible, authentic, and reliable, then that's the time that you need to believe a particular story. Okay? Now, there are two. We are going to look into the difference between the primary and the secondary source. Now, we have there, what is primary source? What are primary sources? Okay? Primary sources are sources or material created at the time of the event. Meaning, what does it mean? Kung kasan-o natabo ang event, the time that that particular source was created. It provides direct or first-hand evidence of an event, or it provides the first full formal appearance of results in physical, print, or electronic format, meaning it's a first-hand evidence. These are materials that present original thinking. It's a material that reports a discovery. It's a material that shares new information. And this is a material that is not filtered by interpretation or evaluation. Meaning, ano gid siya? Amo gid na siyang pinaka-original. Okay? They are sources upon which subsequent interpretations or studies are being based. And of course, these people or these materials this material comes from witnesses or people who are considered to be involved in the event. Okay? Sila mismo ang nagsulat, amo ang tawo nga ara mismo sa event, or ginghambal sa mga witnesses nga nakakita mismo sa isa ka event. That's the primary source. Now, I'm going to give you examples of primary sources. Okay, you have their examples. You have their artifacts. Examples of artifacts are fossils, coins, mga coins nyo bala, or mga coins ni Lula mo nga ginatago niya sa baol. Those are examples of artifacts, and those artifacts are examples of primary sources. Tools, furnitures, clothing, ang mga bayo mo da, ang bayo mo sang grade 1 ka, that would serve as an authentic evidence. And all these things are artifacts that come from the time under study. Another examples are video recordings and audio recordings. Ang ginaubrata nga ni, I'm recording our Google Meet. This is an example of a primary source. Okay, because this is an a video recording as well as audio recording. Those television, for example, television shows, television programs or radio programs, these are examples of primary sources. Diary. Your diary, kung gaubara ka sang diary mo, will become president of the Philippines or governor of Iloilo, that diary that you have, kung mapatay ka someday, kag i-collect nila, that would serve as a primary source of your life story. Another one, eyewitness accounts and interviews. Examples are oral histories, telephone interviews, emails. Those are examples of primary sources. Laws and letters also. Laws, mga sulat, mga laws na ginapas ng Congress, those are examples of primary sources. Letters, ang love letter mo sa amiga mo or sa amigo mo, or ang breakup letters niyo, that's an example of a primary source. How about the other one? Newspaper articles written at the time. Now, for newspaper articles, there are two categories of it. If the newspaper article talks about the event that happened at the time, that is an example, and it was published on that time also, that's an example of a primary source. But if the newspaper article criticizes another event, then that's no longer a primary source. Okay, you have the original documents, like for example, your birth certificate, the last will and testament of your grandparents, marriage license of your parents, trial transcripts. Those are examples of, those are original documents and are examples of what we call primary sources. Then we have also autobiographies. What is an autobiography? An autobiography refers to the story of your life na ikaw mismo ang nagsulat. That is in contrast with biography, which is the story of your government document, mga agreements or treaties. Those are examples of primary sources. Speeches also that were delivered by significant people. That's an example of a primary source. Manuscripts. What does it mean when we say manuscript? For example, you're writing a thesis and ang mga drafts ng thesis mo or the final draft, that's an example of a manuscript. Works of arts, literature, architecture, and music. Like for example, mga paintings, kung nag-ubra ka sang painting, that's an example of a primary source. Tapos someday naging popular ka. Like for example, those paintings made by Juan Luna, paintings made by Fernando Amorsolo, those are examples of primary sources. Novels, poems, buildings, sculptures, musical scores, those are examples of primary sources. Now, how are these different from the secondary sources? These are materials that quote, define, clarify, debate, interpret, explain, examine, investigate, assess, review, process primary sources or original documents. Meaning, these are sources that tends to explain, these are sources that tends to say something about a primary source. These are examples of secondary sources, meaning gina-discuss, gina-describe, gina-interpret, gina-investigate, gina-assess, gina-review niya ang primary source, then that's a secondary source. These are observations written after a fact or event. Therefore, since they are written after a fact or event, they are prone to possible distortions. Pwede sila ma-islan or malain. That's the bad thing about the secondary sources, and they are not actually evidence. They are commentary on and a discussion of evidence. Now, of course, we have here examples of secondary sources includes biographical works. Biographical works are from the word biography. What is that? Hmm? When we say biographical works, those are stories that tends to discuss the life of another person. When you write something about the life of Rizal, when you write something about the life of Apolinario Mabini, those are examples of biographical works. How about bibliographies? Bibliographies refers to mga listings ang references or listing of the books that you may use in your study. That's bibliographies. Commentaries and criticisms, like for example, there was one novel, then after reading the novel, you write a comment about that, or you write a criticism about that novel. Then that criticism or commentary that you made is an example of a secondary source. Another one there, we have articles that interpret, analyze, or review other works. Okay? If those articles ngayong sulat mo tends to review, interpret, or analyze other works, then that's an example of a secondary source. It would become a primary source if that article that you have written is original. Okay? Then you have histories, dictionaries, encyclopedias, textbooks, and history books. These are these are secondary sources. Mga secondary sources sila because the content are not original work of the author, but that's his criticism, that's his commentary, or that is his compilation of the works of others. And again, you have their magazines and newspaper articles. But as I mentioned a while ago, if that newspaper article tend to tell something about the event that had happened on that particular time, then that is a primary source. But if it tells something, or it critiques or criticize or comment on a particular event, then that is a secondary source. Now, try to look into that. The study of history anchored on sources or materials that are reliable, credible, and valid. Why? Because not everything that appears in history books are or is real. Hindi tanan nga makita mo sa mga history books are real. There are things that are written there, because there are things that are written there that sometimes mga ano sila, distortions. Okay, some of these untruths are innocent products of the fag of war or rumor taken as fact. Some are, of course, lies. Okay, there are some sources that are considered to be lies, or stories or history that are considered to be lie. Therefore, in our understanding of a particular event, or in our study of the history of a particular, or the history of the Philippines, then we need to look into sources that are considered to be reliable, credible, and valid. Those sources must be primary sources. Okay? They must be primary sources, but these primary sources must be reliable, credible, and valid. Okay? Questions?